Now, how does a fundraise process by itself work? As you embark on this fundraise process, you will find, as a finance professional or as a founder, you will find a necessity to keep going to the market, maybe once every year or once every 2 years or so, and keep going through all of these stages. So how does this process really work? It's critical to sort of understand that. So you approach the market, you approach investors with what is known as marketing collateral, which is a combination of of a pitch for investors. This will typically be a presentation where you're laying out your company, your story, your journey, your growth plans, and making a pitch for the investors to really sort of take a stake in the business. This presentation should also be accompanied with a business plan or a financial model with projections to really show the investor that you have thought about it in numerical terms as well, and you're actually able to map out and show them how their capital can come in, result in scale for the business, and returns for them. So once you have these elements of your marketing story ready, then you begin your investor outreach. So there are a whole host of investors who are active, domestic investors, international investors as well. And a lot of them differentiate from each other based on which sectors they choose to focus on, what is their risk appetite, like I talked about the whole VC versus PE conundrum, what is the ticket size they typically operate in, and what sort of management teams do they want to see? Do they want to be the first investor in some of these companies? So it's important to understand what investors, how they have behaved in the past, to get a sense of how they're likely to behave, and to get a sense of whether they'll be interested in the opportunity you're sort of putting in front of them. So segment the investors and target the right set of investors to ensure that you have a better outcome in terms of a number of term sheets or interest in the opportunity which you're putting in front of them. There is value beyond capital as well with a lot of investors. So capital is one very important element of it, but especially at an early stage, angels, VCs, a lot of them participate a lot in the growth of the company. They can open doors, they can provide additional business opportunity, and help out in terms of hiring and many other aspects as well. So it's important to have those discussions with investors to say, okay, what can you provide beyond capital? And does it really make sense for the founder or for the management team to really take it up? And that becomes another parameter in evaluation of investors. If things go well, you can have one investor or multiple investors who are interested in the opportunity. And the next stage is for them to communicate that interest in the form of what is called as a term sheet. So a term sheet is a non-binding document. It's just a summary of the terms under which the investor proposes to invest in the company. So this will typically contain the quantum they want to invest, the valuation, and thereby the stake which they hope to get in the company, and certain rights which they expect as investors as well. So this forms a commercial framework of engagement, and the idea to do it is to avoid going through a very sort of extended process of diligence and then discovering that you actually don't like each other or the terms are not acceptable. So you attempt to freeze the terms initially and then go down the path of due diligence and documentation. But does it mean that the deal is done? No, these are non-binding terms. They are subject to change. It's uncommon to see investors changing their terms, but it may happen depending on what they find in due diligence or depending on various other external factors as well, the way the macro works and whatever else, how they view changes on the industry or on the management team as well. So if companies are, very attractive to investors, you may have multiple, sort of term sheets, and you can evaluate multiple offers based on, whatever valuation they're offering or what rights or what value they can offer beyond capital as well. Once you are past the term sheet stage, once the fund and the company signs the term sheet, you get into a process known as due diligence. So up till this point of time, the investor would have relied on the marketing collateral, on the investor page, and on the financial model as well, in terms of putting out a certain term sheet. So due diligence is the period where all of these sort of representations made by the management get validated. So there is typically a business due diligence, which in most cases the fund and the fund management team will perform to understand what is the market size. Is this company really having a good position in the market, and are we really do we believe that the growth which we are projecting will actually sort of happen? Apart from business diligence, there may be a few other elements of diligence. Financial diligence typically carried out by an accounting firm, where they will analyze, they will go through the last 3 years financial statements, records, financial records of the company, not similar to an audit, which where the focus is on validating transactions. The focus in a diligence is on understanding trends, understanding the drivers of the company, and taking a view to see if the projections can actually be achieved. So that's a process of financial diligence. There may also be a legal diligence where a law firm can come in, look at the legal framework under which the company is operating, if compliances are being followed, is there any litigation, what are the contracts of the company, are they drafted in the right fashion. So the outcome of due diligence on the financial and legal side could be a set of findings and a set of corrective actions, which some of the companies may need to take before the transaction actually closes. Now, once due diligence is done, once investor is convinced that yes, what I saw, when I gave my term sheet is corroborated by what I have seen in due diligence, then you get into documentation. This is when you prepare binding definitive agreements, typically an investment agreement or a shareholder or a share subscription agreement. It's sort of the onus is on the company to retain legal counsel to negotiate these agreements, and there will be a process where you go back and forth. The intent of the term sheet gets captured in the agreements, but there may be a few clauses which may be outside the term sheet, which may need to get negotiated. So once the parties sign the definitive documentation, is when it actually becomes a binding transaction. So the companies have the obligation to take the money, and the investor is under obligation to invest the money. So once the documentation is done, findings of diligence, if there are any corrective actions to be taken, that come out in the form of what is known as conditions precedent to closing. So the investor basically says, please take these actions. There are some minor non-compliances, maybe. Please take care of those non-compliances. Once all of that is done, then you can take my funding. So that is the process. Typically, you can expect your funding process to take anywhere from 4 to 6 months or even longer, depending on how your diligence is supposed to. And depending on how investors sort of see interest and how much you have to pitch to them and do investor outreach. But it's important to sort of plan for this process to ensure that there is sufficient runway in the company if it's a loss-making company. You don't want a situation where you're in the midst of a fundraise process and you're running out of capital. You're under pressure to maintain metrics and to show performance to your prospective investors as well. And that puts a lot of stress on the founders and on the finance team as well. So it's very ideal to budget for at least 20 to 15 months of runway before you start your fundraise process for the next round of funding.